The night shift at the old house was never quiet. The building had its way of announcing its presence with creaks and groans that seemed almost intentional. I'd been working here for a few months, getting used to the odd sounds and the oppressive silence that settled over the place when everyone else went home. But tonight was different. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard it. A voice from the basement. I froze in my tracks. The voice was deep and male, its tone low and almost conversational, like someone was trying to strike up a chat. I knew I was alone in the house. The only other person around was the cleaning crew who left hours ago. I thought I'd misheard, but the voice was unmistakable. It seemed to beckon, almost pleading. I grabbed my flashlight and went down the creaky wooden stairs to the basement. The darkness was almost absolute, only broken by the beam of my flashlight. I scanned the room, sweeping the light across old furniture draped in dusty sheets and boxes that hadn't been touched in years. The basement had always felt eerie, but it seemed to pulse with an unsettling energy tonight. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering slightly. There was no response, only the distant hum of the old furnace. I moved deeper into the basement, checking behind stacks of boxes and under old tarps. My heart raced with each new corner I turned, but I found nothing. No one was there. The voice had vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the silence in its wake. I returned upstairs, trying to shake off the dread that clung to me. The silence in the house was now oppressive, a stark contrast to the eerie voice I had just heard. I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing, but the voice had been too clear and deliberate to ignore. The following day, I mentioned the incident to my co-workers. They looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. One of the older guards, Jim, seemed particularly interested. "You know," he said, leaning close, "a guard worked here before you. He disappeared about 20 years ago. Never found a trace of him." I felt a chill run down my spine. Jim continued, "Rumor has it he was working the night shift when he vanished. Some say he got mixed up in something he shouldn't have. Others think the house is haunted." The story intrigued me, but it also unnerved me. I decided to look into the disappearance. I went through old records and newspapers at the local library that evening. The more I read, the more I realized that the guard's disappearance was mysterious. There were no clear leads, only fragmented reports and rumors. As I prepared for my shift that night, the basement seemed even darker and more foreboding. I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me. The voice from the previous night was just the beginning, and I had a sinking feeling that there was more to uncover. With renewed resolve, I braced myself for another long night, hoping that the answers would reveal themselves and I might understand the mysterious voice that had spoken to me in the dark. I'd never seen a house like this before. The sun had barely started to rise, but the light seeping through the cracked windows of the old building cast long, twisted shadows on the walls. Every creak of the floorboards echoed through the empty rooms, a haunting reminder of how alone I was. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling from the night before, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But the memory of that strange voice still lingered when I arrived for my night shift later that evening. The house had an air of decay, with its cracked walls and flickering lights. The faint smell of mildew mixed with the musty scent of abandonment. I couldn't shake the feeling that the building itself was watching me. The basement was where Id heard the voice. I had to go back. I needed to understand what Id experienced, and I wasn't about to let fear keep me from getting answers. I grabbed a baseball bat and a flashlight, thinking they might offer some comfort if anyone tried to make an appearance again. The basement was just as I remembered it, dimly lit, cluttered with old furniture covered in dust, and filled with stale, cold air that seemed to hang in the shadows. I turned on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. The light flickered momentarily, and I took a deep breath, steadying myself before descending the stairs. Every step I took felt like it was echoing through the space. I scanned the room with my flashlight, checking every corner and crevice. There was nothing out of the ordinary, no one hiding, no strange objects, just the familiar jumble of old furniture and forgotten belongings. As I moved further into the basement, I noticed the temperature dropping, making my breath visible in the flashlight's beam. The sensation was unsettling. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The same eerie silence from the previous night seemed to hang in the air as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. I stood in the middle of the basement, trying to calm my racing heart. It could be a figment of my imagination. Perhaps the voice I heard was just a trick of the mind, brought on by the isolation and stress of the night shift. But deep down, I felt something was wrong, something I needed to figure out. When the clock struck midnight, I decided to call it a night. As I was about to head back upstairs, I heard a faint rustling noise. It was as if something, or someone, was moving around. My flashlight's beam danced erratically as I swung it toward the sound, but I saw nothing. I returned up the stairs, feeling a strange mix of relief and frustration. The house's silence was even more pronounced now, as if the shadows were closing on me. I knew I had to find out more about what I had heard. The next day, I spoke to my co-workers, hoping for some insight. Their faces grew severe when I described the voice and the strange happenings. One of the older guards, Jake, finally spoke up. He told me about an old security guard who had disappeared years ago. His name was Tom, and he had been known for his odd behavior and mysterious disappearance. Rumor had it that he had been investigating something in the house before he vanished. Jake's words sent a chill down my spine. It was as if my experience was connected to something much larger and more unsettling. I needed to know more about Tom and what had happened in that house. I was determined to dig deeper and uncover the truth behind the echoes of silence that seemed to haunt the old building. The morning after the unsettling encounter in the basement, I felt a gnawing sense of unease. The voice had been so clear, so natural, yet there had been no sign of anyone. It wasn't like me to jump to conclusions, but the situation started weighing on me more than I cared to admit. I decided to talk to my co-workers about it. As I arrived at the security office, I was greeted by my usual colleagues. I tried to sound casual, but the conversation quickly turned to the night before. "Hey, did anyone else hear anything weird last night?" I asked, trying to gauge their reactions. The senior guard, Tom, looked up from his desk skeptically. "Weird? What do you mean?" I recounted the strange voice I had heard trying to engage me in conversation. As I spoke, I could see their curiosity piqued, particularly Jane, the night shift coordinator, who had been working at the hospital for decades. Jane leaned forward, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "You know," she said slowly, "there was an old guard who worked here a long time ago. He disappeared under strange circumstances." My heart skipped a beat. "Disappeared? What happened to him?" Jane shrugged. "Nobody knows. He was on duty one night. The next morning, he was gone. No trace, no explanation. The police never found anything." Her words were like a jolt of electricity, charging my curiosity. I had to know more. After finishing my shift that day, I went to the local library to dig up any information I could find about the old guard. I started with the regional archives, flipping through yellowed newspapers and faded records. Hours passed as I sifted through dusty files and brittle articles. I found mentions of the guard's disappearance buried in old news stories. His name was Harold Winters, a man in his late 40s. The articles were brief, mainly focusing on the mystery of his vanishing and the fruitless search that followed. Nothing substantial, just hints of the unknown. One article stood out. It described Harold as a dedicated worker known for his vigilance. The night he disappeared was marked by a particularly stormy evening, which might have contributed to the eerie circumstances. There were no clues about foul play, no witnesses, just a vague mention of an unsettling atmosphere reported by other staff members. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. Later that night, I returned to the hospital determined to find any trace of Harold's past. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of purpose, I headed back to the basement, where it all began. The basement was cold and silent, as it had been the night before. I examined the corners and walls, looking for anything that might have been missed. As I searched, I found something odd, a loose floorboard in the corner of the basement. It seemed out of place, and when I pried it open, I discovered a small, dusty compartment beneath it. Inside were a few old items, some personal belongings, a couple of photographs, and a small, worn-out notebook. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up the notebook and flipped through its pages. The entries were sparse but revealing. They described Harold's routine, concerns about the building, and a growing sense of unease. One entry mentioned a strange feeling of being watched and hearing noises that couldn't be explained. Another entry described a meeting with someone he referred to only as a visitor who had never been identified. The final entry was dated the night he vanished. It was brief, almost frantic. "Something is wrong. I feel like I'm not alone. I need to check the basement." The hairs on my arms stood up as I read those words. Harold's last thoughts seemed eerily similar to my own experience. I knew I had to find out what happened to him. Whatever was in the basement wasn't just a figment of my imagination. The sense of urgency was overwhelming. I left the basement with the notebook, determined to piece together the puzzle. I needed to know if Harold's disappearance was connected to the strange phenomena I was experiencing. The answers, whatever they were, seemed to be hiding in the shadows of the old hospital. As I drove home, the weight of what I had uncovered settled heavily on my shoulders. The night ahead promised more revelations, and I was ready to face whatever lay in the darkness. I woke up the following day with a dull ache in my head and a lingering sense of unease. The previous night's events replayed in my mind, each detail vivid and unnerving. I had barely slept, haunted by the echoes of that strange voice and the oppressive silence of the basement. It felt like the house was watching me, waiting for me to do anything. As I arrived at the security office, the first rays of dawn barely illuminated the old building. I rubbed my eyes and tried to shake off the lingering dread from the night before. I knew I had to talk about what happened. It might help me make sense of it, or at least make me feel less crazy. I gathered my courage and approached my colleagues, Tom and Lisa, who were already sipping their coffee and chatting. I hesitated momentarily, then told them everything: the voice, the basement, the feeling of being watched. They listened with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Tom raised an eyebrow, his face unreadable. "You sure it wasn't just the house settling? It's pretty old, and those noises can get weird." Lisa, however, seemed more interested. "Did you find anything unusual down there? Any signs of recent activity or disturbances?" I shook my head, feeling a bit embarrassed. "Nothing at all. I scoured the basement, but everything was in its place. I thought maybe it was just my imagination." Lisa looked thoughtful. "There was a guard who worked here years ago, you know. He vanished without a trace. I heard bits and pieces about it, but nothing concrete." My heart skipped a beat. "Really? What happened to him?" Lisa shrugged. "Nobody knows. He just disappeared one night. They searched everywhere but found nothing. Some people say it was foul play, others think he just walked away. The story's been mostly forgotten." Her words hit me hard. It was like a piece of a puzzle clicking into place. Could there be a connection between the missing guard and the strange occurrences in the house? I needed to find out more. If the house was haunted, if there was a ghost or something else lingering here, it might be tied to the guard's disappearance. I spent the rest of the day digging through old records, newspapers, and any information I could find about the guard. I found a few articles about his disappearance, but they needed a more straightforward explanation. The more I read, the more I felt that something was wrong. The idea that there might be more to this house than creaky floors and dusty rooms was starting to sink in. If I was going to understand what was happening and why I heard that voice, I needed to delve deeper into the history of this place. I had to uncover the truth, no matter how unsettling it might be. When I got home, the first thing I did was dive into the history of the old guard. I started with the basics, browsing online archives and local newspapers for any mention of the missing security guard. His name was Tom Harris, and he vanished without a trace more than 2 decades ago. It seemed like a ghost story to most people, but it felt far too real now. The next day, I visited the local library, scouring dusty microfilm and old records. The library's basement was as musty as the house I was guarding, but it felt oddly fitting. I found a few sparse and largely speculative articles about the disappearance. According to the reports, Tom had been working alone during a night shift when he vanished. There were no signs of struggle, no clues, just an empty security booth and an open door leading to the basement. I pulled out old maps of the building and compared them with the current layout. It looked like the house had undergone several renovations over the years. I noted where rooms had been added or removed. It struck me that the basement was once a storage area before being repurposed for other uses. What could Tom have been doing down there that might have gotten him into trouble? Next, I went to the local police station. Thanks to a sympathetic officer intrigued by my story, I managed to get access to the old case files. The case was cold, with no significant leads or suspects. The file contained a few notes from Tom's colleagues and a sketchy witness report of a shadowy figure seen near the basement entrance on the night he disappeared. As I sifted through the notes, one detail stood out. Tom had been known for his thoroughness. He would often stay late to ensure everything was secure, and he had reported feeling uneasy in the basement in the days leading up to his disappearance. The more I read, the more convinced I became that there was something significant about that basement, something that Tom might have uncovered or stumbled upon. I decided to head back to the house that night, armed with the new information. Is there anything in the basement that could shed light on the mystery? I felt like I was following Tom's footsteps, retracing his last actions. As I stood at the top of the basement stairs, flashlight in hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was getting closer to uncovering something profound. The first few nights after the incident felt strangely quiet, but it wasn't long before the unsettling occurrences started again. I was determined not to let my nerves get the better of me, but as each night passed, the atmosphere in the house grew increasingly unnerving. One night, as I patrolled the second floor, I heard a soft, echoing thud from the basement again. I froze, listening intently. The sound came from the same area where I'd heard the voice. My flashlight flickered as I descended the stairs, the beam dancing across the darkened walls. The basement had always been creepy, but now it seemed even more ominous. The air was colder, and every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe. I reached the bottom of the stairs and scanned the room. The only light came from my flashlight, casting eerie patterns on the old cobweb-covered walls. I noticed that the shadows seemed to move on their own, subtly shifting as if they had a life of their own. I shook my head, trying to clear my mind of these thoughts. As I walked around the basement, the temperature dropped noticeably. I could see my breath fogging in front of me. I checked the old furnace and the water heater, anything that might explain the temperature change, but found nothing out of the ordinary. That's when I heard a sudden sharp creak from above. I sprinted up the stairs, but everything was eerily still when I reached the first floor. My heart pounded in my chest, and I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I walked through the empty rooms, checking every corner, but nothing. The next night, I experienced another phenomenon that left me questioning my sanity. I was in the living room, trying to focus on the old newspapers I'd gathered about the missing guard when the lights flickered. They went out entirely for a moment before coming back on. The sudden darkness was suffocating, and I could feel a chill crawl up my spine. Then a whisper, barely audible but distinct. It seemed to come from behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. My flashlight illuminated nothing but the space. I stood there frozen, listening to the silence that followed. These experiences were starting to take their toll on me. Each night brought new, inexplicable phenomena, rustling noises, sudden temperature drops, and glimpses of shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. I wondered if the house was somehow alive, or if the ghostly presence I'd been trying to understand was becoming more active. I knew I had to push through this. My investigation into the old guard's disappearance was far from over, and these unsettling disturbances seemed to be leading me closer to the truth. I had to find out what had happened in this house, and why the spirit of the missing guard seemed to be reaching out from beyond. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong in the house. The strange noises and shadowy glimpses were one thing, but this constant, unsettling presence felt personal. I knew I had to confront it, whatever it was. The basement had become a place of dread. Each night, the chill in the air seemed to grow colder, and the whispers grew louder. Armed with a baseball bat and my trusty flashlight, I descended the stairs with every nerve on edge. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the basement's dusty corners and cobwebs. I braced myself, knowing I had to be prepared for anything. Tonight, I was determined to make contact. I set up a small makeshift ritual area in the center of the basement, arranging candles in a circle despite their flickering light, adding to the already eerie atmosphere. I placed the baseball bat beside me, just in case, and took a deep breath. My voice trembled as I called out into the void. "Is someone here? I know you've been trying to reach out. I want to understand. Please, show yourself." For a few moments, there was nothing but silence. The only sound was the distant hum of the house settling and the occasional creak of the wooden beams overhead. I felt like a fool talking to the shadows, but I couldn't shake the gnawing sense that this was my only option. Then, as if on cue, the temperature dropped suddenly. A cold draft swept through the room, extinguishing one of the candles. My heart raced. The shadows seemed to writhe and shift, and I could have sworn I saw a figure moving in the periphery of my vision. "Please, if you're here, let me know. I want to help," I said, my voice more insistent now. The flashlight flickered, and a sudden clattering sound echoed through the basement. I spun around, heart pounding. I saw a shadowy, indistinct form in the beam of light at the far end of the room. It was barely more than a dark streak, but it felt like it was watching me, waiting. "Who are you? What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The air grew dense, and I felt a strange pressure around me, as if the space were tightening. The shadows seemed to pulse with dark energy, and I could hear faint murmurs that sounded like words, though they were too muffled to understand. The basement was filled with an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional sound of my breathing and the distant creak of the house. Then, just as suddenly as it began, everything went quiet. The shadow receded, and the temperature in the room returned to normal. The candles flickered back to life, and the flashlight steadied. It was as if the presence had withdrawn, leaving me with racing thoughts. I knew I had to come back again. Something was here, something that wanted to communicate but remained elusive. I had only these unsettling encounters to guide me for now, but the mystery was far from over. I was determined to find out what had happened to the ghostly presence and end the eerie disturbances that haunted this old house. The basement felt colder than usual that night. I'd spent the entire day digging through old archives, dust-covered newspapers, and files from the hospital's long-forgotten records. My findings were intriguing and unsettling. A few old articles mentioned the disappearance of the night guard, James Callahan, who had vanished over 30 years ago. It was clear that something had gone wrong, but the details were sketchy at best. I returned to the house with a stack of yellowed papers and a growing sense of urgency. With its oppressive darkness and eerie quiet, the basement seemed to pulse with a strange energy. I made my way down the creaky stairs, flashlight in hand, and set up my makeshift investigation station with the documents I had unearthed. Reviewing the old newspapers, I found a small but telling detail. James Callahan had been investigating suspicious activity in the basement before his disappearance. Reports mentioned strange noises and sightings of unexplained figures, eerily similar to what I had experienced. My hands trembled as I read further. There were rumors of financial discrepancies and shady dealings linked to the hospital's administration during that period. Suddenly, a cold draft swept through the basement, causing the papers to flutter and the dim light from my flashlight to flicker. My heart raced. I could almost sense the presence of the ghostly guard nearby, watching, waiting. I couldn't ignore the feeling that I was getting closer to something crucial. I decided to take a bold step. Using the newspaper information, I cross-referenced old personnel files and financial records. It didn't take long to uncover a significant lead, a hidden storage room in the basement that had been sealed off years ago. The record suggested that this room might have contained evidence or information that could shed light on Callahan's disappearance. Determined, I moved towards the back of the basement, where the old storage room was said to be. I had to force open a rusty door, and as it creaked open, I was greeted by a musty, stale odor, and the sight of a minor, dark space filled with old boxes and forgotten equipment. I shone my flashlight around, searching for anything unusual. My eyes fell on a dusty, locked metal cabinet in the corner. With some effort, I managed to pry it open. I found a collection of old files, photographs, and a ledger inside. Flipping through the pages, I found documents detailing illicit financial transactions and notes about potential witnesses who had mysteriously vanished. One name stood out. Dr. Harold Peterson was a high-ranking hospital administration official at the time. His name was linked to the financial discrepancies and the suspicious activities that James Callahan had been investigating. It was clear now that Callahan had stumbled upon something he shouldn't have, and his disappearance was likely a result of his discovery. The ghostly figure in the basement was seeking justice, or perhaps trying to warn others of the dark secrets buried in this old house. I knew I had to act quickly. With the evidence, I planned to report my findings to the authorities. This case, now more than just a haunting, was a cry for justice from beyond the grave. The basement was colder than usual that night, an icy draft slipping through the cracks in the old foundation. I tightened my grip on the baseball bat, its solid weight offering a small measure of comfort. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but dust and cobwebs. Yet, something felt different tonight. A palpable tension that made my skin crawl. The familiar scent of musty decay hit me as I descended the stairs, mingling with a faint, almost metallic tang. I paused at the bottom, listening intently. The house was eerily silent, but I could sense an unseen presence. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever was to come. I approached the spot where I had first heard the voice. My flashlight danced over the walls, the shadows playing tricks on my eyes. Suddenly, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath misted before me, and I shivered despite my thick coat. Like a distant groan, a low, guttural sound echoed through the basement. My heart pounded in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is someone there?" For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my voice echoing off the walls. Then, the light flickered, and I saw a figure standing at the far end of the room, shrouded in darkness. The apparition was vague, its form shifting like smoke. It wore an old-fashioned security uniform that the missing guard had worn decades ago. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped forward, the bat raised in readiness. "Are you the one who's been causing all this?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure turned slowly, and I felt a chill run down my spine as its hollow eyes met mine. It wasn't just the ghost's unsettling appearance, but the profound sadness in its gaze. I took another step closer, compelled by fear and curiosity. "Why are you here?" I pressed, desperation creeping into my voice. "What happened to you?" The ghost began to speak, its voice a husky whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The words were fragmented, but I could make out enough to understand the tragedy. The guard had been betrayed by someone he trusted, left behind in this very basement to die alone. As the ghost's story unfolded, a sense of dread washed over me. The details matched the clues I had found. The discrepancies in the old records, the hidden documents, it all pointed to a betrayal and a wrongful death. The apparition extended a spectral hand towards me, its gaze pleading. "Help me," it whispered. "Find the truth. Set me free." The weight of the guard's request was heavy. I nodded, determined to finish what I had started. "I will," I promised, my voice unwavering. "I'll make sure your story is known." The ghost's form began to waver, the oppressive chill lifting slightly. It seemed to relax as if a significant burden had been eased. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure dissolved into the shadows. I stood alone in the basement, the silence now heavy with resolution. I knew what I had to do next, to ensure the guard's story was told and justice was finally served. The chilling encounter had brought clarity, and with it, a renewed sense of purpose. The basement was colder than usual that night, an icy draft slipping through the cracks in the old foundation. I tightened my grip on the baseball bat, its solid weight offering a small measure of comfort. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but dust and cobwebs. Yet something felt different tonight, a palpable tension that made my skin crawl. The familiar scent of musty decay hit me as I descended the stairs, mingling with a faint, almost metallic tang. I paused at the bottom, listening intently. The house was eerily silent, but I could sense an unseen presence. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever was to come. I approached the spot where I had first heard the voice. My flashlight danced over the walls, the shadows playing tricks on my eyes. Suddenly the temperature dropped sharply. My breath misted before me, and I shivered despite my thick coat. Like a distant groan, a low, guttural sound echoed through the basement. My heart pounded in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is someone there?" For a moment, nothing but my voice echoed off the walls. Then the light flickered, and I saw a figure standing at the far end of the room, shrouded in darkness. The apparition was vague, its form shifting like smoke. It wore an old-fashioned security uniform that the missing guard had worn decades ago. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped forward, the bat raised in readiness. "Are you the one who's been causing all this?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure turned slowly, and I felt a chill run down my spine as its hollow eyes met mine. It wasn't just the ghost's unsettling appearance, but the profound sadness in its gaze. I took another step closer, compelled by fear and curiosity. "Why are you here?" I pressed, desperation creeping into my voice. "What happened to you?" The ghost began to speak, its voice a husky whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The words were fragmented, but I could make out enough to understand the tragedy. The guard had been betrayed by someone he trusted, left behind in this very basement to die alone. As the ghost's story unfolded, a sense of dread washed over me. The details matched the clues I had found, the discrepancies in the old records, the hidden documents. It all pointed to a betrayal and a wrongful death. The apparition extended a spectral hand towards me, its gaze pleading. "Help me," it whispered. "Find the truth. Set me free." The weight of the guard's request was heavy. I nodded, determined to finish what I had started. "I will," I promised, my voice unwavering. "I'll make sure your story is known." The ghost's form began to waver, the oppressive chill lifting slightly. It seemed to relax as if a significant burden had been eased. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure dissolved into the shadows. I stood alone in the basement, the silence now heavy with resolution. I knew what I had to do next, to ensure the guard's story was told and justice was finally served. The chilling encounter had brought clarity, and with it, a renewed sense of purpose.